I am sitting here in the library in Portales, New Mexico, which those of you who are very up on the events of the science fiction calendar year will know what I'm doing here. But for those of you who are uninitiated, I am at the Jack Williamson Lectureship, and I am sitting here with Patrice Caldwell. If you could say hi.
Hi, everyone.
And Patrice is a professor here at Eastern New Mexico University, and she coordinates the Jack Williamson Lectureship. And it seems most logical to start with some background on who Jack Williamson is for the uninitiated. So, Patrice, do you want to start with sort of a bio?
Absolutely. Well, Jack is a wonderful success story for New Mexico. He came here as a young child, actually on a covered wagon. Great story. But he'd just been born, and the family spent some time in Sonora, Mexico. But then they homesteaded in New Mexico, as many other ambitious and poverty-stricken people did, and tried to farm. It was very tough. He and his family, he was the firstborn, so he was the oldest of 4 siblings, and they homesteaded out in South Roosevelt County, which, if you know South Roosevelt County or counties of New Mexico, you know, very dry, very harsh terrain. You can raise crops and cattle, but it's tough. So for Jack's early life, as he likes to say, he lived in his imagination. He went to country schools or was homeschooled. His father was well educated and a school master himself. His mother wrote, so he had a very literate home life, but did need to get off the ranch to go to school. And there was a windfall when his father sold mineral rights on part of their land. And with $1,000, which was a huge amount of money in the 20s, he and his sister went to Canyon, Texas, where Jack enrolled at what is now Texas A&M University, but was then Texas State College. And his sister finished high school. So he'd started reading Amazing when it first came out in 1926, fell in love, corresponded with people in the back letter columns, as they did, and found like-minded individuals. Borrowed a typewriter from his uncle, immediately started writing. Where he found the courage to do this is a complete science fiction mystery, but he did. And 2 years later, which is an extraordinary track record, as I know you know, Emily, in December, he published his first story. And
he sold a story every single decade for how many decades?
9 decades.
9 decades. Yes. And that's a record that's probably going to stand for quite a while.
I suspect, since he was 98 when he passed away.
Yeah. So, and he won his last Hugo in 2005.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and he passed in 2006, but he didn't just write, I mean, he wrote spectacular genre-founding works right at the beginning and continued to produce award-winning works all the way up until the end.
He did.
He was made a Grand Master of Science Fiction Writers of America in the 1970s.
Yes. In 76, he was the second Grand Master named after Heinlein, and right before Asimov.
And the terms
terraforming, psionics. He, I believe, is the first user of the concept Prime Directive.
Okay.
And, of course, genetic engineering.
All coined by Jack Williamson. So you could say that science fiction would not be what it is today without Jack Williamson.
I would agree.
He was one of the early movers and shakers, and he continued to shape the genre all through his life that ended still quite recently. Mm-hmm. So he was a writer. He also was a professor. Now, was that his first job, or did he work other jobs before he became an English professor?
It really was his first job. Writing was his first love, but as he said, need a day job. Mm-hmm. So he completed his master's degree in English at Eastern and taught for a few years at New Mexico Military Academy or Institute in Roswell, New Mexico. Mm-hmm. But then when an opening came available, he came back to Eastern and taught from 1960, actually, until he retired in 1977. But his career at Eastern really extended to the rest of his life because he taught classes afterwards. So yes, he was an academic, And he did publish his dissertation, and he did a dissertation at University of Colorado Boulder. But I think his first love was, he always saw himself as a writer.
A writer, yeah. And so when did you meet him?
Well, I came to Portales in 1980 as an assistant professor of English. And, of course, Jack had retired 3 years earlier, but the lectureship was in its 4th year. So I went to the lectureship knowing absolutely nothing about science fiction.
Right.
But a colleague of mine had invited Jack to come and talk to his class. So he said, you have got to meet this man. So I came. And, of course, Jack was always gracious, always kind, always interested in other people. And so, of course, we immediately became friends. And then, since I continued to go to the lectureship, we would run in. It's a small town.
Yes, it is, yeah.
So you just become friends. And he was so generous. His family is wonderful. Then I met his niece. We became friends. Then the whole family. So I got on the lectureship committee to help organize, and then when the coordinator retired, I sort of bounced into that, and that was really nice because, of course, Jack was the connection that brought people to Portales.
Yes.
It's not the climate, it's
or the
not
location,
nor the location. Quite right. So it was the long, friendly arm of Jack Williamson.
Yeah.
So it was blissfully easy to run a lectureship because he would just say, let's ask, why don't we see if we get Harlan Ellison? I said, okay, let's see if we can get Harlan. And Harlan came.
Right.
So, that's pretty much how it was.
Well, Jack was always an incredibly open and warm and humble man for all of his accomplishments. Connie Willis has a story of him showing up at the WorldCon panel on what the magazine editors are looking for in short stories today. Oh. And so, you've got your young new writers trying to break in, and you've got Jack Williamson sitting there in the room, and one of the panelists said, what are you doing here? He's like, well, I still like to write short stories, and I'm just want to hear, what you're looking for today.
Of course. Yes.
And, everybody else in the room was thinking, you're Jack Williamson, you could write anything.
Exactly.
But he still had that, he had that humility. He had that sense of he always had to be learning, and he always had to sort of be taking in advice, and he never reached that point where he felt nobody had anything to teach him.
That's so true. Yes. Yes.
Did you have much academic interaction with him when he was at the university?
Yes. We team taught the creative writing class and the science fiction class alternating springs, which worked really nicely because we would be able to showcase the lectureship, and we would read works of the people who were coming or have them come to class and talk about their creative process. So that worked out very well. It also gave Jack the opportunity to travel in the fall to conventions if he wanted to, or do other traveling. So the team teaching was wonderful because, of course, he knew everybody, and then I could grade the papers. So it was a really great opportunity. Plus, I got to read science fiction at, basically the recommendation of a Grand Master. Right. So it was kind of nice. So he'd say, oh, well, no, that's not really a good Heinlein. Read the early stuff. Or, he would just say, when he met Connie Willis, he said, we've got to get her here. Let's teach Doomsday, which we did. We taught it. The first semester came out that we could. So, that was a wonderful opportunity for me. And I think it's the best way to read science fiction. I had not read any science fiction except Ray Bradbury, because it's not really regarded in academic circles as appropriate.
Right.
But it still has that problem.
Right.
So here I was thinking, why are people saying bad things about this literature? It's actually, pretty darn good. Plus, students like it. Why aren't we teaching it? So,
and science fiction. The community often gripes about how there is a lot of mainstream literature that is in fact science fiction, but there's a sort of definitional boundary that people don't want to define themselves as science fiction if they are being accepted in the sort of the mainstream literary circles. And in general, at this university, how much is science fiction emphasized, or what does the English department mainly specialize in?
Well, we have a superb special collections with Jack's library. In fact, his personal library is the core of our science fiction special collections. So we have all of the runs of Beyond Mars, the comic strip that he wrote. We have many of his manuscripts and, of course, all of his work and many of the works of his friends. So a lot of classes use it as original research, primary materials. So that's one way. We don't have anyone on the staff who is or who has a field in popular literature or contemporary literature or science fiction. So that's a bit of a downside. But we do have a creative writing professor, so he incorporates, aspects of Jack's work. But I don't think we still have a rather traditional department, and in some ways it's very hard for them to work in what many people regard as a subgenre.
Sure.
So it's not as much as I would like, but it's more than most than most places.
Well,
so.
And that's the thing. It's you don't tend to see a whole lot of academia talking about, looking at the history of science fiction. It tends to still very much be sort of an outsider to that whole establishment. And even while Jack Williamson was here, there were a lot of people who, would you say, came to study with him?
Yes.
Because of the science fiction.
Absolutely.
But it was very much him and you and the department as a whole certainly allowed it, but there wasn't. It didn't specialize in science fiction. And
exactly right. Yeah.
So let's talk about the lectureship, because the lectureship is really one of the great hidden gems of science fiction. If you are looking to broaden your experiences in science fiction, to meet more writers, and to hear a lot more about sort of the cutting edge of where science fiction is today, a lot of people haven't ever heard of the Jack Williamson Lectureship. And a lot of people, even if they have, look at where Portales, New Mexico is on the map and think that's a long way to go in order to experience this. I would exhort anybody who is listening, who's the least bit interested, to come down to Portales during the lectureship week and start talking about what the lectureship is.
Absolutely. Well, the lectureship began the year Jack retired in 1977, and the then dean or the assistant dean of the college recommended that we should recognize Jack, probably one of our best known alums, certainly one of our most published alums, incredibly generous to the university with scholarships and other kinds of bequests, and it met with incredible support from the administration and the department. So in 1977, it was inaugurated with Fred Pohl and Jim Gunn. And you can't have
minor.
Just
minor names,
tiny little lights on the horizon. And since then, it has focused on the role of science and the humanities, which is always was a passion for Jack, but it allowed for a rather wide range, not always writers. So as the lectureship matured, it became more focused on the writing of science fiction because science fiction writers changed in that time. In the 70s, science fiction writers often had a science background, but they then wouldn't be writers. They would wish they could or something like that. But now that's not true. Science fiction writers are very astute in terms of science and the humanities and are wonderful for the theme of the lectureship to show those connections. So I think that has been a major change for the lectureship. Of course, the greatest change is the loss of Jack in 2006, and we thought the lectureship would go away too.
We were all afraid that was going to happen.
Yes.
But fortunately, it has run for 9 years now since, and we've got the guests lined up for next year.
Yes.
So a little bit about the format of the lectureship. Every year there is a guest or two. Sometimes there are two guests, and I guess I've got the list here of everybody who's been, but it's a pretty august list of science fiction luminaries. So the first year that I came to the lectureship, the guests were Bob Silverberg, the year that he was made a Grand Master by SFWA, Fred Pohl, who was already a Grand Master, Jack Williamson, who was a Grand Master, and the Toastmistress is always Connie Willis, who is herself a Grand Master. And I don't know that you see 4 Grand Masters anywhere, even at a Nebula's weekend. I mean, that is an incredibly high concentration of this very, very elite group of authors, and yet it's kind of par for the course for the Williamson Lectureship.
Absolutely. Fred had been here before, of course. Bob Silverberg had been here before, but that was a wonderful lectureship. The one that was your first. Just the interaction of those three men who have shaped science fiction, and friendships extending decades. And Fred edited Jack, and they both knew Bob when he was a whippersnapper, and all these things, these stories came out, and of course Connie was the newbie. So it was wonderful, and that happens every year. These reunions are just an opportunity to see the range of science fiction and the network of these friendships that are so important to the field.
Yeah, they really are. And so this year the guest was Paolo Bacigalupi. Has been featured in Time magazine and other minor publications like that.
Yeah, the Hugo, the Nebula, the Campbell,
the Theodore Sturgeon.
Right.
And next year we've got
Victor Milan, and of course, Victor has been a friend of the lectureship by distance, because we always see him at Bubonicon, the Albuquerque science fiction convention. And finally, his work is really legendary, and he's published widely, but under so many different names, a lot of people don't know him.
Right.
So, he's charming. He knows everything about science fiction, and the committee just said, why don't we ask Victor to come down? I bet he'd come. So we invited him this year just so that he'd have an opportunity to meet everybody, and I think it's going to be a great lectureship.
I think it's going to be fantastic. So, and I will post an update on Blackgate closer to the time to remind everybody to come on down to Portales. So the lectureship, it basically takes place over the course of a week. Most of the events are on the Friday of that week, but on the Tuesday is what's the first event?
Well, we usually do an informal on-campus reading from the works of Jack Williamson, on the theory that students turn over about every 4 years, sometimes 6, and a lot of people don't know about Jack. And we like to read from excerpts of his work, both speeches he's given, but mostly his fiction, and let students hear how science fiction sounded in the 20s, how it sounded in the 50s, the 90s, and then in 2005. And it's illuminating. I mean, we're always astonished, because here we are reading a passage that uses the term genetic engineering, and then we say, first use of this term, or something like that, and people say, what? No.
The creation of the android.
Exactly. How did that happen? And the term humanoids. Wow. So I think that's really fun for us, because there's all these light bulbs going around, and people are saying, well, I thought that was a Star Trek term project. And we say, well, yeah, but science fiction they stand on the shoulders of giants. So, I mean, it's fine that you think it's Star Trek, but here it is, right here in the humanoids. So that's a wonderful event to begin with. Then we usually skip a day and, recover. And then our guests start arriving Thursday. And we usually do a reading either of the guest of honor, if his plane is going to arrive safely, or other writers who are here. And that's a great kickoff, because a lot of people really have not been exposed to science fiction at all, or to good readings of
science.
It. Nobody reads like the writers who come here. They are fantastic readers. It hooks most people coming to those readings. Then the next day is, as you say, the full day. We begin with another reading and conversation about the writing of science fiction. We go to the lectureship luncheon, which, of course, we sell books, but Connie Willis, of course, handles that brilliantly, recaps the history of the lectureship, and then the guest of honor gives an address. Then and of course people have to pay for that lunch, which means not many students, but the students come to the panels in the afternoon, which you were gracious enough to help us with, Emily.
Anytime.
From 2 to 6 we run, 3 to 6 we run a kind of con-like panels, but they tend to be a little more academic, maybe.
I think so.
A little less media oriented. So we did comic books and YA, but we did, also some environmental science panel.
And how not to sell your first story.
I love that.
That was fun.
That was great.
There's all of this great content at the lectureship, but I think the thing that makes it in a class of its own as far as events goes is all of the personal contact and interaction that you get with the guest of honor and the other featured guests every year. So the first year that I came to the lectureship, when Jack was still around, you'd go to check into your hotel. There was pretty much just a Super 8 here in town.
Yes, that's right.
And on the front desk would be a handwritten note saying, "Come on over to Jack's," with a map to Jack Williamson's house drawn out. And you'd check in, and then you'd drive over to Jack Williamson's house, and that is where people would meet up and start socializing. And Jack would be there, and you'd be in this living room with what you thought were a bunch of knickknacks until you actually looked at one and realized it was a award of some kind. So, that's the first time, I ever saw like the, a World Fantasy Award and all of these things. And Jack himself was such an incredibly gracious and welcoming host. He would spend time with anybody, answering questions and just sort of, being very present and being very much a part of the lectureship that was named after him. It really was. And I think part of the reason why people feared the lectureship going away once he was gone is because he was so central to the lectureship. It was really a chance to go and spend time with Jack Williamson and the other guests who were there. So that usually was Thursday night.
Yes, that's correct.
And nowadays, instead we go to the one steakhouse in town,
right,
for a dinner. And,
very rowdy group.
And of a bunch of writers. And then on the Friday, this year was a little unusual because Paolo did his reading on the Friday morning.
Right.
But typically the first event of the Friday is the actual...
Guest of honor reading,
is the actual luncheon.
Correct, yes.
And the guest of honor speech. And then after the lunch, there's usually an hour or so of time, and there's a long tradition that goes along with that hour.
Oh, there is. It's the Connie Willis ice cream run.
Yes.
And we used to all go to Dairy Queen, but then Dairy Queen closed, so in fact, Betty Williamson, who writes a column for the newspaper, wrote, "Can the lectureship survive the loss of Dairy Queen?" But it did. It did. So now we go other places and eat ice cream. We eat all the way through this lectureship, don't we, Emily?
Yeah, we pretty much do.
And talk.
Yeah.
Eat and talk.
And talk, and people make the guests sign stuff. And,
Yes, shy people come up and ask for signatures, yes.
But if that Dairy Queen had a list of all of the science fiction luminaries that have been there are, probably convention centers that don't have a list like that of the people who have been in that Dairy Queen, and so it's too bad that it's gone.
Yes.
But we would all sit in chairs at Dairy Queen, and people would have these high concept conversations about trends in science fiction, or the themes in this or that, and while we ate our blizzards and peanut butter parfaits and all of that. And then the next morning of the lectureship, the Saturday, is when you've got now a writer's workshop.
Yes. We started trying to reach out to young writers in the area, and the schools, of course, are very supportive. So Connie generously agreed to do a young writers workshop. Steve Gould agreed to assist, and this year Laura Mixon.
So a Grand Master, the president of SFWA, and the Tiptree Award finalist
are all teaching
a little writers workshop in Portales, New Mexico.
Right.
For free. Now, actually.
For free. So I think that's a wonderful opportunity, and I think it's really important. I think most people have this impression that writers are very remote, and they are solitary. I mean, that's certainly true. But they're very, as Jack said, we don't want to be hermits.
Right.
It's just how you have to work.
Right.
So this is an opportunity for young people, I think, to interact, as you say, up close and personal with these writers who are kind and funny and, self-effacing and really smart. And I think it's a great introduction to writing and then, of course, to science fiction.
Well, because science fiction actually does, as far as the genres go, probably has the greatest amount, I guess you say, of author-fan contact. If you want to know your favorite science fiction writer, and you make a habit of going to conventions, that very much can happen. And the thing about the lectureship is that it's got that same ethic, but it's on a smaller scale, and there are fewer guests simply because of the location. You really get the advantage of that. Writers do not cloister themselves. They don't, consider it beneath them to talk to,
Not at all.
People who have not yet sold their first book. They remember being that person. Yes. And so they, there is this incredibly rich dialogue, I think, that goes on between the authors and.
That's true, and they'll take pictures with the students who are here from Portales High School, and the students will take pictures of themselves, like looking at the authors. So it's very home-like. It is like a homecoming more than or a family reunion more than a con, but it has all the best elements of a con.
Right.
So.
I definitely agree there. Do you have any funny stories from a Williamson Lectureship? Or I know there are a bunch, but are there any your particular favorites?
There are. Well, I guess my favorite is the Exploding Cow Lectureship.
Oh, the famous Exploding Cow.
The famous Exploding Cow. We had Scott Edelman here, which in itself was a trip, and Chris Rush, lovely person, yes. And Dean Wesley Smith, hilarious guy.
Yeah.
So we're all in the car going back to Lubbock Airport, which is, you take the Kakawati cutoff, and
Yeah.
So we're driving along, and Scott looks across the way, and he says, that cattle truck is getting awfully close to that train. And he says, that cattle truck is really close to, that train is really close. And then there was this boom, and the cattle truck had actually been struck by the train. It was a country crossing, so you know how these are. They're not barred.
Yeah.
Well, there are cows literally flying all over the place, and then the ones who weren't, maimed outright were walking on the highway and cutting across 4 lanes of traffic. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, there wasn't much of that.
Right.
Scott hops out of the car and runs across 4 lanes to talk to the driver, who is on his cell phone telling his wife, "Oh, honey, it happened again."
Again.
Apparently, so we don't even want to know that story. Chris, of course, the logical woman, is calling 911, and then Scott came back, and we all called Jack and told him what had happened, and he said, "Are you all right?" And Scott said, "Yes, Jack, we're fine, but there are a lot of cows." And he said, "Get back in the car, Scott. You don't know how to work around animals." So, anyway, it was just they didn't want to leave. And I said, plane to catch, get in the car, we have to go. But that was one. Now, what was really great about that was that their first instinct, of course, being writers, was to get the story. Right. Their second was to call Jack and tell him all about it. And so it was really fun that they brought him there because he wasn't there, and then they all passed around the cell phone to talk to him and tell him what they saw and how. So that was great. But I think the really best lectureships were the ones when they would sit at, all of you would sit at Jack's kitchen table and just talk.
Yeah.
And he would say, that's a great idea. Oh, you have to do that. Oh, well, I look forward to seeing it. Well, may the force be with you. He would say this, and people would go away like on cloud 9. And, I've been there. I've seen students have the same experience, and I know what a gift that was. And he was so generous with that kind of gift.
I guess Fred Saberhagen's first year at the lectureship, Jack Williamson said, "Oh, you're that promising young author." Fred Saberhagen, his career got going sort of when he started collecting his Social Security. It was and so, but compared to Jack, I suppose he was. I mean, and the Williamsons are a very long-lived clan, and so it wasn't terribly surprising that Jack lived to be 98. But another interesting thing about science fiction writers, for people who have worked with many of them, met many of them, or been on a listserv, email listserv with many of them, is that quite a few of them are complete Luddites with the technology. I mean, there's a listserv I'm on where still, if you want to email a graphic, people freak out because some of them are still on dial-up in 2015. And what was funny is that Jack was on this listserv as well, is the one person who always had the latest technology and was the most proficient with it was Jack Williamson. He always had, a modern computer, and he knew how to use email. He learned how to use email in his 80s.
Yes.
And he never stopped learning, and he wasn't one of those authors who was still sending in typewriter manuscripts to his editor. And those still exist even today.
Mm-hmm.
People who still cut and paste is literally cutting and pasting. You don't find many of these people in society at large, but if you find them anywhere, it's in the science fiction writing community,
Exactly.
which is incredibly ironic given
Yes,
what science fiction is about and the futures that these people envision for all of us, and yet they'll still be living in what a lot of us would consider the past. But Jack was always up on the latest.
He was. That's a really good point. He got a computer as soon as it came out. He said, I kind of like WordStar. What are you using? And I'm thinking like, my gosh, I've got a university supporting me. He's doing this all by himself. Figured out, reprogrammed keyboards and did all of these things. He experimented with voice recognition software as soon as it came out. When he collaborated with Fred Pohl in the writing of Singers of Time, Jack word processed his, mailed it to Fred. Fred rolled paper into his typewriter and typed his, revision. So, even Fred Pohl, who's, But I think Jack's interest in science really almost predates his love of science fiction. He studied science in college. He avidly read science magazines and science his entire life. And I think technology was a natural extension of that. Plus, the hermit thing, he didn't want to be a hermit. He wanted to be connected. And he was a touch typist. And he thought email was pretty fabulous. He'd correspond with his agent and editors all the time. FTP, he did it all. And he thought everybody did that. The students certainly did it. He could do what they did. Right. So, yes, he never was technophobic about anything. Except cars. We were both really bad. Well, cars were a mystery.
I never knew that about him.
Now, his brother, Jim Williamson, was a mechanic during the war.
Okay.
But Jack was a weatherman because he tested very high in science. And he'd taken physics, and so he and Fred Pohl were both weathermen during the war. So there was science in his life, and I think technology was a natural and comfortable outgrowth of that.
Sure. And he spent his early years on a ranch. And how long did he live out at the ranch before he moved into town?
Well, he was out there until he married, really. He traveled a lot, though, and I think he was off the ranch after he came back from the war almost as much as he was on the ranch, and because he would travel and he would spend some time in Los Angeles, or he would go, he took classes at Cal State, UC Berkeley, and so he was around a lot more than most ranch kids would have been, but he was very close to his parents who were living out there. Of course, Jim was out there, his brother. They was very close to his brother. So he was very tied to that land. And as you know, because you've been out there, it's a stark, it's a landscape for the imagination.
It really is, yeah. And he's got it's almost like a shed that he would write in, and it's still out there.
Yes.
And there was an attempt, wasn't there, to move it into town to sort of preserve it?
There was a conversation about that, and they contacted Jack about it, and he said, well, I don't think we want to do that, in his nice, gracious way. Yeah. And so the city, of course, immediately said, okay, Jack, okay. But that's where it belonged, and that's where he wrote, and that's where he felt it should be.
And that's where it stands today. Yeah. My last memories of Jack are coming down to the Williamson Lectureship when he was really getting up there. He was really starting to get frail, and his house had a whole sort of office space, the office/library, where he would write. And I remember towards the end of his life, there was also his bed in there, and that's just as his life was drawing to a close. Yes. And he was sort of, withdrawing from the rest of his house. That's kind of where he chose to be and to spend his time. In his last days.
He would teach class. We would teach the classes at his home because it was easier for him. The students went into that room like a shrine because they couldn't believe. Well, first of all, there were books all over, and then when they noticed that they were his books, some of them, and then his computer and his workspace, and and then of course the awards in the living room. So yes, being in a writer's home, and especially as your compass shrinks, the most important things you keep close.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the room he spent almost his whole, that in the kitchen,
Yeah,
the kitchen,
right.
of course.
It's right next to,
I would go there in the morning, and Jack would be making breakfast. He was a farm boy, and he always had eggs and grits and all of that. And then he'd go into his room and he'd write, and he'd work every day.
Every day, yeah.
So that was his life. He couldn't be away from his books and his computer.
Right. Well, and unfortunately, the person is no longer with us. But I would say that a lot of Jack still survives in this lectureship, wouldn't you?
I would. And part of that, of course, is all of you coming back. And part of it is being in Portales, which is so much part of his work. I don't think people realize how often there are references and allusions to landscapes that people say, Portales.
Right.
Oops. Yep. Yeah. That's the college. Oh, okay. Well, that's the library. Yeah. So it infuses his work, and he infuses this landscape and this Portales community for us.
Right.
So,
and it's the type of event, because it's small, people might think it would be the sort of thing those of us who are in the know about it would want to protect. But to be honest, I think it only gets better with more people, and there is plenty of Jack's spirit to go around, and it's truly,
true.
It is truly such a unique experience. I would highly recommend to everybody, if even just for 1 year, come out and see what it's about. And
well, thank you, Emily, because you've been here and you understand it, and I agree. It's the people who make it, but being here makes it very special.
Yeah, it does. So thank you so very much.
You're welcome.